think because this is relatively short program, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in this really muggy, gross weather. We were afraid that this hot weather is going to be a deterrent that prevents many of you to come. So I'm really glad that you're all here. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to the group of Sound Alban School. It's a these are all like high school students who are interested in public policy issues. So it's a great way to start getting welcome and keep it up for the rest of the high school. And hopefully you will find this discussion will not scare you off or bore you out of that realm. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a director here on the Japan program at Stimson. One of the great benefits of being in think tank and having your own program is I get to decide what I wanted to research. And for the last several years, I've been increasingly thinking about the ways to connect two strands of conversation that's happening when you think about U.S. strategy toward Asia. One line is a conversation, whether that might be a defense budget or strategy, that tends to happen among the strategists or budget evaluators community, which is fairly separate. And the other strand is the conversation that happens amongst the U.S.-Japan alliance managers, which is even smaller community of analysts and thinkers. And oftentimes, lots get lost in the translation, like this title of this report says. So I've been attempting my humble effort to try to connect those two conversations in two relatively separate worlds. The first attempt was a few years ago when I wrote the report, Opportunity Out of Necessity, which is the report that I focused on how the conversation on the defense spending in the United States, which really revolved around sequestration back then, how that's been perceived in Japan, and how that might affect our ability to manage alliance with Japan. And this, Lost in Translation, Defense Innovation in Northeast Asia, is a second attempt at that. But I picked a different topic this time. For the last few years, many of you have probably heard of terms like disruptive technology, third offset, rebalance to Asia. But a lot of the times, those conversation happens amongst the group of people who shares the same terminology, same interest, and same background. And it's very hard to get beyond that parameter. So my hope is that by reading this report, whether you agree or disagree, that will get you interested in trying to connect those two worlds and have a more wholesome conversation about this whole issue. And as the title suggests, this report attempts to connect the debates on the defense strategy within the United States and how this conversation is being received or perceived in Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia is a very interesting space. Obviously, there's a pressing concern about North Korea, but then in addition to that, China, Japan, South Korea, two of them are our closest allies in Northeast Asia, and one is one of the major power competitor of us. They all reside in a relatively close space from one another. And the mutual mistrust amongst the three often really exacerbate the security anxieties amongst the countries, and then also sometimes prevents what seems to be a common sense security cooperation very difficult. Typical example is a U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral cooperation over the North Korean threat. And now that we have the conversation in Washington that constantly talks about America first, less and less about multilateralism, how does this affect this whole dynamic? And the U.S. and then because of that, it is, I think, extra important for the United States to have a conversation with their allies and competitors and have good communications on its strategic intentions and and what it sees, and shares at least shares the understanding of where each other stand. But is that really happening? And this report is our small attempt to take a cut at that. I'm joined today by two great men, both of whom I'm very, very grateful to be with me here today. First is to my left, your right, my left, is Alex Bollfrass. He's a non-resident fellow at Stimson. He's a longtime colleague of mine, actually, at Stimson, who focuses on who used to focus on nuclear non-proliferation issues. He's currently working on the PhD dissertation at Princeton University, and from my understanding, he's about to finish.
That's right.
Congratulations. I invited him up here with me today because he led the interviews that we conducted in Japan and South Korea and China. All of those conversations took place in Chatham House Rule, which is what got said in the room, stayed in the room with no attributions attached to any specific individual. And he was at the conversation in all three countries, so it was imperative for me to have him here. He will talk a little bit about the major findings of the report and the recommendations of the report. And he will be followed by Dr. Thomas Mahnken, to my right, President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. If it's okay to say for me, he and I are SAIS alum, but he comes from strategic studies where all the smart people at SAIS went. So I wouldn't probably have survived there. But aside from that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning at Pentagon from 2006 through 2009. And during that time, he was one of the chief architects of the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review and 2008 National Defense Strategy. And he has also taught at the SAIS, his alma mater, at Strategic Studies, and then also Naval Postgraduate School. And you joined CSBA last year? About a year ago. So he will add his own thoughts after reading this report. He was one of the reviewer of the report, so it was great. I'm grateful that he agreed to do this for us. So without further ado, since this is a short program, so I'll turn to Alex.
Well, thank you, Yuki, for that very kind introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this really interesting and important project. And also thank you for ordering such good sandwiches. It's not always a given on a Friday. And to you all, thanks for being here. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to walk you through some of the highlights of the report with a particular kind of perspective in mind. There's about 4 parts to what I'll be giving you as a reader's guide as you take these home and look at them in greater detail. First, I'll lay out a little bit of what exactly the strategic challenge is in the Northeast Asian region that confronts the United States and our allies, and point out that there are some technical as well as political dimensions to this. Then I'll move to a description of some of the technical solutions that have been percolating through the U.S. defense community over the last couple of years that are meant to address this set of problems. Third, I'll draw on the conversations that we had in the region, trying to synthesize some of the perspectives of the defense communities in South Korea, Japan, and China, and discuss how they view some of these technical conversations as well as the political dimensions that they are meant to address. And then finally, and most importantly, of course, I'll offer you, for your consideration, a set of recommendations that we've proposed that would help bring together the technical components as well as the political components, both of which are necessary if the United States is going to smartly address the strategic challenges in the Northeast Asian region in the future. As they say, you need 2 hands to clap, and this is sort of the idea here. Okay, so first, just very quickly, Yuki has already laid out some of the strategic dimensions in the Northeast Asian region. It's not a secret to anyone in this room that it's a tense constellation there. Of course, we have the relationship between the United States and China, as well as the North Korean problem. And more broadly, the United States faces a challenge of asymmetric threats that can take the form of a disruptive technology that would undermine the U.S. power projection capability. In the Northeast Asian region in particular, the concern is that China has an active strategy to find these kinds of weaknesses and leverage these kinds of disruptive technology. So this is why it's valuable to focus on this region in particular from the perspective of defense technology. This problem is not new to anyone, which is why in the last couple of years it has become part of the defense transformation discussion in the United States and has acquired the perhaps temporary label of the third offset strategy. Excuse me. The intellectual and the bureaucratic history of that concept is detailed in the report. I won't go into too great a detail here, but it's important to note that at the moment it seems like there are roughly two strains of thoughts on what the United States could do to maintain a qualitative military technological edge globally and with that in the region as well. On the one hand is the view that a third offset strategy would focus on mobilizing over-the-horizon technologies and being smarter in defense procurement and taking some of the technological edge that is enjoyed by the United States and leveraging those into a defensive edge that can be enjoyed by the United States and our allies. A second way of thinking about it is a need for operational and organizational innovation in the defense space. And so this would then be targeted directly at these kinds of asymmetric threats that may emerge into the future. And for the history buffs out there, you'll know that this is the third offset intending to borrow from the success of what was later called the first offset strategy. You might know it better as the new look of the Eisenhower administration, where the United States invested heavily in nuclear weapons to offset the Soviet conventional advantage. And the second offset strategy maybe is roughly co-equal with the revolution in military affairs that occurred in the 70s and 80s. So with these ideas in mind, we went to the region, had these conversations with defense analysts in China, Japan, and South Korea. There are, of course, not any kind of monolithic views that emerged from this. You could almost adapt the old joke that in any room with 3 defense analysts, you have 5 opinions. But maybe just to highlight a couple of headlines. In this case, in Japan, what emerged fairly clearly is that the defense community there doesn't quite understand what the third offset strategy or the conversation about the third offset strategy means for the future of the U.S. strategic presence in the region. On the technological side, there was a lot of concern expressed about the long lead times about the technologies that are under discussion, especially when you match it up against the threats that are most important from a Japanese perspective emanating from North Korea. So the thought is, well, it's nice if you have a new super weapon in 15 or 20 years, but at the expense of what in the meantime? And finally, in Japan, there was a sense that a United States that is so focused on maintaining a qualitative defense technological edge might leave Japan behind, leave Japan dependent on the United States, also at the expense of the Japanese defense industrial capability. There's similar views in South Korea. The biggest concern there was that none of the discussion addresses the direct immediate threat from North Korea. This is understandable, but also a broader sense that assurance of an ally is not about the technological particulars that might be on offer in 10, 15, 20 years, but it's a much bigger political project. It was interesting to have this conversation in China, of course. The most noteworthy thing was that the details of the third offset strategy were followed there in much greater depth than among our allies, which is a point of concern. There was generally agreement that the third offset strategy, even if presented as this global concept, is really aimed squarely at China. Very little disagreement there. But overall, there was less concern about the United States developing individual futuristic technologies and more of a desire to foster the overall political relationship between the two countries as part of this discussion. So if one believes, as I do, and I believe we all do, that some of the concepts behind and the motivation behind the third offset strategy are worthy and should be pursued, these conversations showed us that there needs to be a separate political track to accompany these technological discussions, because the signals that are being sent over the Pacific while we are having this conversation here in Washington get mixed and misinterpreted. Towards that end, towards synchronizing these political and technical efforts, we have 4 recommendations in the report. The first one is there's a clear need for both Track 1 and Track 2 conversations between the United States and our allies on these issues. It's simply unacceptable that a potential competitor like China would have such a nuanced understanding of what it is that we're talking about on these issues, and our allies have not received the same kind of information. Another conversation that should be had between the United States and our allies is about the difference between what makes for an effective warfighting force posture and what makes for a sensible peacetime deployment in the region. And here we sort of get into questions of what works for assurance and what works for deterrence. And of course, the big elephant in the room is about basing. How many troops are forward in the region, and in what kind of configuration, and equipped in what way. Finally, there really is a need for joint force planning between future force planning between South Korea and the United States and Japan, and ideally with a trilateral element to that as well. Most of us are aware of the historical difficulties that are presented here, but this would help bring into alignment U.S. future force planning with the needs of our allies. And I overpromised by saying finally in the previous point, but now really finally, there is a need for procurement reform. This is not a new call in the city, but we suggest that whatever procurement reform takes place needs to take into account the ability of allied defense industries to contribute in a meaningful way, and to let them be sustainable in the long term, and not just focus on selling U.S. technology to our allies. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Great, thank you, Alex. Tom?
Great, thanks, Yuki. First, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and thank you also for inviting me to review the monograph. I think first off, I want to echo Yuki's overall goal of bringing together regional specialists with military and strategic specialists, because I think the challenges that we face, both in an alliance context and more broadly, are bigger than any particular field. And I think the more perspectives we can get on these issues, the better. And I think similarly, the topic of this report as a subset of that is straight on, bringing together and bringing developing a conversation between those people interested in defense innovation, third offset strategy, and our foreign policy, our alliance relationships. And I think that's particularly germane because if we look at the United States and U.S. national security strategy, at least since World War II, we really have put a lot of weight on 2 asymmetric advantages. The first is our network of alliances, which really is and has been a unique American strength. And the second, in the military realm, at least since World War II, the United States has sought to gain and preserve an asymmetric qualitative advantage over competitors in the military realm. Back in the Cold War, it was all about being able to fight outnumbered and win against a Soviet military, a Warsaw Pact that deployed many more soldiers than we had. And I think it's been proven time and again that qualitative edge, that involves not just technology, but also operational concepts, organizational concepts, and so forth. That qualitative edge has really been key to American success on the battlefield, but that American success, military success, has underpinned our alliance relationships and the broader American role in the world. Well, it's important to understand that and to examine these areas, because each of these asymmetric advantages today is under threat. Our alliances, or the cohesion of our alliances, is under threat for a whole bunch of reasons, ranging from domestic politics in various countries to transnational trends to efforts by some countries, such as China, to sow discord among us and our allies. And similarly, the American qualitative advantage is also under threat. Part of it is just, again, is in a way inevitable, as the technologies that the United States pioneered have spread. So the ability to strike with precision, which involves not just guidance, but sensors and command and control, was once a very closely held capability. Now it's very widely held. So in a way, it's just sort of the natural diffusion of an innovation. But also, there's a changing balance of power. There's security dynamics. So each of these asymmetric advantages is under threat. Now, the third offset strategy is clearly, or has clearly been, an effort to remedy that, or the erosion of the American qualitative advantage on the battlefield. But I think, one of the important messages of this work, and I think one of the important messages that we need to take forward, is that needs to, should not occur to the detriment of our other asymmetric advantage of our alliances, and really, ideally, should actually strengthen our alliances. There's no reason that can't take place. And I think this monograph does a nice job of laying out some opportunities to do so. And I think particularly if we look at Northeast Asia, or we look beyond Northeast Asia, and not just at Japan, South Korea, but we could also include Australia in this. There are some great opportunities to tap into areas of innovation among our allies, and to collaborate, to integrate, to operate more effectively together than we have done in the past. But there also are obstacles, and I think some of those have already been alluded to. And many of these obstacles are perfectly understandable, and because of that, they're not easily surmounted. But I think the first step to dealing with them is to understand that they're there. So the issue of secrecy, again, is perfectly understandable. Militaries, particularly when you're talking about developing cutting-edge capabilities, try to keep that very closely held to preserve an operational advantage in the future. But that also leads to misperception. Misperception not only with allies, but competitors, and even maybe at home as well. Second, when we're talking about developing new capabilities, new technology, we impinge very quickly upon domestic industrial policy. And things that Company A is developing, and Company A might be a world leader in, Company A would justifiably be reluctant to share with a whole bunch of competitors at home and abroad. So we have to manage that as well. And whether it's Japan or the United States or South Korea, there's always a preference to buy at home first before going out and buying from others, including even among allies. So that's a challenge in a globalized technology space. How do we collaborate in some of these areas? A third set of obstacles has to do with expectations, maybe unreasonable, inflated expectations on both sides. So allies, I think, tend to think that we're doing much more than we actually may be, that we possess capabilities that we don't. Competitors, similarly, are apt to attribute all sorts of things to us that we can't do, don't want to do, aren't interested in doing, gave up on doing a long time ago. Or maybe that they want to do, so they project it on us. And then similarly on our side, I think there can be inflated expectations of allies, both in terms of what they're capable of doing, in terms of supporting defense, but also what they're capable of doing in terms of sharing technology or various things. And I think if we're going to move forward in a fruitful way, we need to get those expectations realigned. And I think this project does a nice job of starting us down that path where we can have good, realistic expectations so we can move forward together on areas of innovation like the third offset strategy, because we need to. I think we need our allies, and our allies need us. And if we're smart about it, we can maintain, even bolster, our asymmetric advantage in terms of our alliances through collaboration in the defense sphere. So with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tom. Let me make sure. Okay, my mic is on. Before moving into opening the floor up to the conversation, Barry, I'm sorry, I didn't ask you in the beginning, but can I turn to you for your first comment? I single you out because without you, this project really didn't start, and I'm sorry I didn't pre-consult you. But if you have any additional thoughts to share before we just open up the floor to everybody else, you have the prerogative as someone who kept prodding me to do this. So, all righty.
Promise of great capabilities 20 years from now is far less important than immediate responses to the threats that are posed immediately. I think that's a very important insight, so I just highlight that.
Thank you, Barry. With that, open up the floor. Raise your hand, and please wait until the microphone gets to you, and then identify yourself. And if you're asking questions, just particular one of us, please do that, but then feel free to ask it to all of us. So with that, Saito-san, the gentleman with the yellow tie.
Thank you very much. I'm Lieutenant Commander Yusuke Saito from Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. Thank you very much for sharing your views. And my question goes for Dr. Alex Bollfrass. And my question is about third recommendation about joint future force planning. Actually, because of the current threat of North Korea, trilateral cooperation among U.S., South Korea, and Japan is proceeding little by little, such as GSOMIR and maybe ASW exercises also. But in terms of future force planning or future cooperation, trilateral cooperation, if you have any specific domains or areas that trilateral cooperation will be required, could you share us? And if you have any specific potential threats in the future, please share with us. Thank you very much.
So, how about Alex?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for that. A very good question. First, I'd like to highlight why the future force planning is maybe an easier lift, but also a more important lift than the near-term problem, and that is as the United States goes to the drawing board and tries to envision how to defend the region with its allies, this is a moment where Allied input still can have the biggest effect. Right? So that's why maybe this is something that's should be focused on before trying to think about 2-3 years down the line. In terms of specific domains, I would just guess, this is just my opinion at this point, that things like surveillance systems, early warning systems, especially as it relates to North Korea, obviously, could be quite useful, and the maritime domain more generally. given that they're areas of interest to all parties concerned.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But actually, I'd also like to go back to Barry's comment in the earlier point about allies and capabilities today versus in the future, because I think it actually it's a key point, and I think it's a key challenge both with innovation in the U.S. And also working with allies, which is this is a problem that industry faces as well as governments, which is, and I think it's a problem that Clayton Christensen I think chronicled very well in his book The Innovator's Dilemma, which is there's a tendency for industry, and again I would extrapolate to militaries, right, to focus on solving today's problem, and that's completely understandable, right? In industry, it's what does your client want, what does your customer want, and you better fill your client's needs. And clients know what they need today, but they don't really know what they need 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Now, 5 years from now, they'll expect somebody to have something that fills their needs then, but they're not really thinking about that then, right? So there is this and it goes against like 90% of business literature, right? You can be too close to your client. You can be too close to your customer. And I do worry about that a little bit in an alliance context, meaning we do have to assure allies today. We have to take care of that, but we can't. But we also have to think about the future, and we have to think about the future together. And I think if current trends continue, I mean the future is not going to be like today, just more so. It may be significantly different. So we need to figure out a way to both assure and deal with today's challenges, but also position ourselves for a security environment 10 years from now, 20 years from now that may be very different. So I think that really is it's an important insight from this work. I think it's also a structural challenge, right? Because we have whole parts of the military, of the government that deal with the here and now, and that's what they're here for. And then you have a little bit of the government, the military, that deals with the future. And there is an imbalance between those parts. There probably should be. Again, we do have to take care of today to get to tomorrow, but we have to keep those things in balance. So.
I think one thing, if I were to add one thing to in response to Saito-san's comment, is the cyber is the domain for the joint force planning. But in the cyber domain, though, I think in this country, we're still talking about how to operationalize really how to deal with this threat. And then also there is that technical disconnect that cyber tends to be kind of carved away as a separate domain for geeky guys. But then but then it has to be able to be operationalized amongst the rest of the force. So I think that is a challenge that has been going on. Can you wait until the microphone, please? Thank you. Sorry, we're recording this, so.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'd like to direct this question to Alex. And as someone personally who's puzzled over the third offset, and I've heard Mr. Carter speak about it many times, Mr. Work, excellent talks. But I was so interested in what you said about the Chinese seeming to have perceived some layers here that others haven't. And could you be a little more specific about which areas that they have understood better than some others? Because that seems so significant.
Sure. It's a very simple and disappointing answer, which is that they understand that this is not a fully mature concept, yet that it is an expression of a desire to have a third offset strategy rather than an already completed package that is ready for distribution.
Stanley Kober. 20 years ago, the retired Egyptian Minister of Defense wrote an article in which he said the decisive weapon of the future would be the suicide bomber. The article was published on September 11, 1997. 5 years later, to the day, we were struck. We talk a lot about defense innovation. Well, we have taken casualties from low-tech, things like suicide bombers, suicide shooters, improvised explosive devices. How do you deal with the low-tech threat?
Good question. Can you take this?
Look, I think my answer may disappoint you, but my answer is we've spent over 15 years partially successfully dealing with that challenge. And during that period, we have spent much less time, much less intellectual energy on challenges that are far more consequential both to the United States and to the world. And so I think we need to we need to focus on some of those more consequential challenges. So if you look at the lethality of modern conventional weapons, and it's on display for those who want to see it, in Ukraine, for example, you have lethality many times, tens, hundreds of times, more than a suicide bomber or an IED. Or you look at modern cruise ballistic missile technology, again, the ability to inflict much more damage there. And so my concern is that a good chunk of the world is sort of sleepwalking into a much more lethal combat environment. And I say sleepwalking in homage to a book, The Sleepwalkers, looking at the Europe on the eve of World War I. Okay, so we've lived in a period where the U.S. had enjoyed, in multiple senses of the word, a qualitative advantage on the battlefield, and that qualitative advantage is going away. And what's likely to replace that is a more level battlefield that's much more lethal. And these weapons not only in the hands of states, but also non-state actors. So you look at the Houthis, perhaps with some help, launching cruise missiles against U.S. and foreign combatants. Look at Hezbollah using precision-guided munitions, drones. That's happening. So wouldn't discount the suicide bomber, but I wouldn't become transfixed by it to the detriment of even more consequential threats that are out there.
And then I'll get to you.
Hi, Jonathan Corrado. Looking at the way that domestic and regional tensions over the THAAD missile battery emplacement in South Korea have really affected our ability to fully deploy the system and make it operational, how robust and collaborative are discussions regarding this third offset? How robustly do they take into consideration non-technical factors, these sort of political matters that, as we've seen, can become so important to our strategic posture in the region?
So I guess that connective link often gets dropped when the conversation moved from the effective battlefield force laydown conversation into how to make this work with allies, which also has its own domestic political issues to deal with. And then I think that we're seeing that in full display in the THAAD deployment issues in South Korea right now. But then even in Japan, you see that it can blow up in a flash if there's like a major accident in Okinawa again. This whole base politics comes to the fore. So that's why we felt that a report like this could be a good first step to kind of raise an awareness that this disconnect needs to be tended to, because everybody would like to speak from the same game book. So it's much more comfortable for regionalists who gets into nuts and bolts of this alliance management structure to just talk amongst ourselves. And then I think I would say more or less the same way, just that there are more of you in the strategic debate, strategic community. And then, but if U.S. is making this advantage that we've enjoyed so far, which is network alliances, and how we draw strength from these networks of alliances, to make it something more sustainable, this link needs to be filled. And it's much more important now with all this technological connectivity, both vertical and horizontal proliferation of these technologies. And we just felt that part of the conversation was, a lot more of that conversation can be happening. So I'm sure there are a lot of people in the, pure strategic community who read this report and say, oh, this is so naive. It just, whole thing is like more big, it's the strategy is like much bigger than this. But the real point of this is like, but wait, you implement strategies, you need two to tango. So you need allies to know where you're going to make your, to amplify the strength, whatever the strength that you may find in your new strategies that you're offering. So, your point is absolutely well taken. There needs to be a consideration of that, and our concern that the maybe not enough attention is being paid was the starting point of this report.
Hi, Alex Napper with St. Albans School of Public Service. Kind of going off that previous question, how has the THAAD system kind of altered the relationship between the new administration, the Moon administration, and the current administration in the United States?
Very interesting. It's I think we will yet to see the real impact of that, because the new president has not yet said, no, THAAD is definitely not happening. He ordered review, but final decision has not been made. But if you, I can draw a parallel example from Japan, where my comfort zone is that when Japan had the new prime minister, her policy outlook was, I wouldn't say similar to President Moon's, but then different from his past predecessors. He ordered the whole review of whether this relocation of a Marine Air Station should move forward as has been planned and determined by his predecessors. And everybody kind of rained hand and very nervous for the next 9 months or so. And actually, after studying every single option that he has been briefed on, he actually had to come, very reluctantly, but he had to come to the conclusion that current planning is the only workable plan. So I think we're still in the phase of the similar period where people are nervous about new president. A lot has been said about what he said about U.S., what he said about China, what he said about North Korea during the campaign. But I think people are still hopeful that, just like the way it happened in Japan, after several months of revisiting and studying, he would, as a responsible leader of South Korea, the deployment of THAAD, letting it move forward, is the responsible way to move forward to protect South Korea from the immediate threat that's facing the 38-degree border. Great question, though.
Tim Sharrock, I write for The Nation and the Korea Center for Investigative Reporting in Seoul. I want to follow up on the last two questions. I just spent 2 months in South Korea, in southern South Korea, in Gwangju, South Korea. And I have to tell you that, I think when your assumption that South Korea and Japan and the U.S. are natural military allies goes contrary to the political direction in South Korea. And I think you're assuming a whole lot. Moon Jae-in has made it very clear during his campaign that he wanted a slightly different relationship with the U.S. military, and he has talked about the Comfort Women agreement, which the U.S. has strongly backed as a way to keep these allies together. So that's under question, and I don't think the intelligence sharing arrangement is that popular either. So you may be making a big leap in terms of your understanding of this, South Korean politics. I mean, 80% of the people there have said in polls they support bilateral talks between South and North Korea. And it's a very different government than the last 10 years. And so I want to ask you, I think you should go beyond. The same is true in Okinawa. It's reaching boiling point there with the anti-base opposition. And I think, maybe your assumptions are way beyond the reality of the real domestic situation in South Korea.
Thank you for the comment. I think one response I would have is U.S., South Korea, and Japan are not necessarily a natural partner. In countering North Korean threat, though, they are a logical partner. That two are very different things. And why I don't use the word natural, but just say logical, is because of the underlying tension that has been existent between Japan and ROK over the past history for a number of decades. But what's natural and what may or may not be popular amongst the general populace may not always make sense as a logical policy choice for the government to protect its people and protect its national interests. So I think that would be the response that I would have. But your point is very well taken. I think a lot of times, both countries in domestic politics, it has a complexity of its own and difficulties of its own. And Okinawan politics is very complicated, not only because of the base relations, but then because of Okinawa's historical relationship with the central government in Tokyo and mainland overall. So your point is well taken, but that would be the response.
Yeah, well, I guess what I would, and this is actually tying up, several of the questions. Look, the United States, Japan, ROK, are democracies. They're liberal democracies, and that is fantastic. It's fantastic both for the populations of those countries, but also I think more broadly. As a result of that, political leaders are accountable to the voters. They have to run for office. And one of the things you do when you run for office is you differentiate yourself from those who went before you. We've seen that in our country. We've seen that in other countries as well. Sometimes there's a tension between that and what what your interests are, what a country's interests are, and that gets worked out. So what I would say about U.S., Japan, and Korea is, and particularly from an ROK perspective, I would just point to interest, and I would point to geography. And as a student of geography, any contingency that would occur on the Korean Peninsula, ranging from a disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, all the way up to war, in any contingency, the geographical reality is that material, people passing through Japan are going to play a key role in any such future contingency. That's geography. That's geographic reality. So what I would say there is it's in South Korea's interest to cultivate a military-to-military, a political relationship with Japan that is fit to task at the very least. That's so interests, domestic politics, and then we could add in, if we're getting into innovation, technology development, domestic industrial issues. They all play. Are they challenges? Yes, but I'd focus us back on the big thing, which is we have alliances with some of the most prosperous liberal democracies in the world, and that is a very good thing.
Quick little follow-up on that. Two little follow-ups. One, if you look back at what was going on in Europe during the Cold War, especially let's take Germany as an example of another divided nation, there was a lot of popular sentiment out of touch, out of tune with what the national policies were. And you had opposition candidates campaigning against the tight coupling with the United States and for a more open policy towards the East. And when those opposition candidates came into office, they undertook a policy review and quickly determined that some of the promises that they'd made didn't actually make that much sense once they were in office, and that went on for quite a long time and was rather stable. And then just to pivot a little bit back to this particular project, what we're advocating for here is for us to find a way, for the United States to find a way to make us a more attractive ally in the long run. Let's find ways of working together and really making sure that everyone's security interests and strategic interests understood most broadly are taken into account in the future. So that maybe is a way forward.
All the way to the front.
Hi, my name is Russell. I'm with General Atomics. I had a question for Alex. And in regards to the talks you've had with South Korean defense experts, how aligned were their views with the new president and kind of some sort of his vision he has for North Korea?
Do you want to take that?
So this is off-the-record conversation, so who were in that conversation goes unnamed, but their view were, shall we say, different from what this current president has said during the campaign trail and the initial days in his presidency. But as if Japanese example and Germany example are any guide, it is also highly probable that after these reviews, even if reluctantly, he would come to that similar place as the leaders of other countries who, would eventually got to that place. But no, I think it was a very different tone of a conversation that we had in South Korea. Grant, gentleman with the blue tie.
Hi, Jeff Abramson with the Arms Control Association. I want to echo an earlier warning about we often focus on the high tech and forget the lower tech that are often more involved, but this is not what the conversation is today. I have a couple of different questions. One is, I haven't gotten to read the report, where do you feel there is not alignment on the perception of China? I know this is very much about China. I haven't been able to look at to see whether these three countries have a different take on China. And then separately, question more around the budget and thinking around the third offset. Often to counter a technology is much more expensive to counter it than a small improvement of that technology, which overwhelms the counter defense. Where is the thinking so far, and how much can really be spent going down this path, and how much is more, okay, China might develop X, Y, Z, and we'll not be able to directly counter that in some way. And then as a technical question, were these interviews conducted after Trump came into office? Just sort of a sense of where the thinking is.
So from the last question first, yes, this interview was conducted February this year. So yes, about a month into the new administration. So that's why it was a very interesting overtone in the conversation on all three, especially in Japan and South Korea, because that's when you would still hear the president talk about, you got to pay or we're going to leave. So there was that overtone to that. For the perception of China, of Japan, or that of Korea, right? I think we came away with the impression that obviously South Korea, because they are because of their much greater proximity to China, and it's land, connected by land essentially, that they're more conflicted about how to respond to China or how to deal with China. But then I think what was striking about our conversation in Japan was, yes, we did spend a fair amount of time talking about North Korea and how these new over-the-horizon technology comes to fruition in 15, 20 years is nice, but then no, it doesn't work with us on South Korea, on the North Korean threat. But much larger conversation was spent on, we really kind of wonder, like, even if those technology comes into fruition in 15 to 20 years, maybe China would be way ahead of you by then. So conversation was very more focused on what the strategic balance between Japan and U.S. and China over the long term, like beyond 50, 20 years down the road, as opposed to South Korea, it was predominantly about North Korea. What you guys are doing over the long term doesn't help us at all to deal with North Korea today, and that's what we care about today. So that was the difference, the biggest difference, I think I would say, in the conversation in Japan and South Korea. And in terms of the budgeting, excellent question. I think Pentagon takes two-pronged approach, right? Once on the long-term one, they have this DUIX, innovators, but then more of a short-circuit one, they have Strategic Capabilities Office, and the whole purpose of their endeavor is to look out across the board on the existing technology with a little bit of a modification or upgrade you could use for today's threat or near-term threat. But and then I think as far as my understanding is that the SCO office continues to receive pretty good amount of funding, And I think what would be interesting to see is now that under 2017 NDAA, the Acquisition Technology Holistic Bureau is going to go under a whole overhaul. So when they come out of that, how would those budgeting, and especially when it comes to long-term investment, who would handle that, how it's getting assigned? But that's more in the CSBA line.
Well, no, I guess what I would say is when it comes to innovation and countermeasures and cost, it's really hard for me to generalize, right? So, but let's kind of break it into several parts. So let's even talk about cost and complexity. So, yeah, there's some innovations that cost more than the things that they replace and are increasingly complex. But you can also see cases where over time things actually become much simpler. So if we think about early generations of guided weapons and the amount of money, technology that went into guiding weapons with precision before the advent of the GPS constellation, it was tremendously expensive and complex. Now with GPS, with precision navigation and timing more broadly, it's actually a lot cheaper. Now, okay, but then GPS as a constellation was quite expensive, but it's ubiquitous, right? We have GPS in our iPhones. It's all over the place. So judging cost in that way, I don't know that I can draw any hard and fast conclusions. Now, there are some, but what I would say is the innovations, the big innovations that have proven consequential, that have changed the character, the conduct of war, have been innovations that have been robust against countermeasures. Go back to nuclear weapons, right? I mean, we've been working on countermeasures to nuclear weapons ever since nuclear weapons still aren't there. And can I see cases like that potentially in the future? Yeah, I mean, I think if, and I posit it as an if, not a when, but if we get to militarily useful directed energy, I can see that as very cost effective relative to current missile defenses and relative to ballistic and cruise missiles. Again, will we get there? I don't know. Smart people who know much more about it than I do say, yeah, we're actually fairly close. But that could be a case of actually being something that's quite robust. So I think you raise a really important point. I just don't know that it's either or.
Can I just add a little note on this, on the countermeasures to asymmetric threats? I think there's been a lot of unglamorous innovation and success in this realm. Just as an example, if an insurgent in Afghanistan shoots a mortar, an old-fashioned mortar at U.S. forces, they have a 7% chance of dying because our countermeasures are good enough and can respond that quickly. So you could say, well, that counter system is much more expensive than an individual mortar, but you're imposing a pretty heavy cost onto your adversary. And these are small little things that are being developed as we fight these seemingly interminable wars.
Great, thank you. Well, I think I'm liking this 1 hour proposal. Well, we're at the end of the hour. I wanted to thank you all for again coming in this hot weather, and thank you, Tom and Alex, for joining me. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.